Good morning, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Metal Meltdown. Today we are talking about the latest studio album from Jesus Piece entitled So Unknown. This is the sophomore studio album from this American hardcore metalcore crew, hailing from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the city of brotherly love. I was a big fan of their debut album Only Self when it dropped back in 2018. It was brutal, it was punishing, it was thrilling. It also surprisingly had a lot of versatility and range and experimentation to it. Like, it had a really good balance of influences from, 90s metallic hardcore, more modern metalcore, classic death metal, sludge and doom metal. Looking back, that was probably one of the best metalcore albums of that year, maybe even one of the best metalcore albums of the 2010s, at least in my opinion. Obviously, with that in mind, I was extremely excited for So Unknown, especially now that Jesus Piece has the support of Century Media Records. And while I have to concede immediately that I am not as enthralled by So Unknown as I was by Only Self, I do think overall this is a very solid record and a more than worthy addition to the Jesus Piece catalog. One thing I noticed about So Unknown right off the bat, a lot of work has been done to streamline everything that I've come to know and expect from Jesus Piece. This is probably the tightest and the most cohesive that Jesus Piece have ever sounded. This is definitely the most mature and the most brutal that they've ever sounded. Some of the experimental flavors have been toned down and subdued just a touch, not to the point where I would call this one-dimensional or straightforward. This is still a very dynamic listen overall, especially from an emotional perspective. As drummer Louis Aponte recalls and writes in this press release, the making of the record was nothing short of all-consuming. It was an intense and challenging process. The record reflects a lot of confusion, but also evolution. There was a lot of uncertainty and emotion during the pandemic. We all changed and grew so much. So if there is a single thought or concept to the record, it's constant metamorphosis. That's also how we operated as a band on this LP, spending a lot of time songwriting and fleshing things out as a unit, and then upping our game from there. It's definitely a reflection of us as more mature, playing the best we've ever played, and feeling like a real band for the first time. You've got opening track In Constraints, which wastes absolutely no time whatsoever, immediately bombarding you with vicious, violent, distorted, guttural vocals and chunky, chugging metalcore riffery. It's just kind of constantly pounding and battering with these groove-laden metalcore beatdowns. There's a simplicity and brutality to this that even brings to mind some caveman death metal. There is a slightly more atypical metalcore breakdown near the very end, but honestly, even that remains pretty effective thanks to the insane amount of, energy here. Not to mention the build-up to it with the more frantic and erratic percussion and the scattered guitar parts. That's great. A lot of dread, a lot of hype, a lot of fun. Then there's Fear of Failure, which kind of sounds like mid-2000s Code Orange or Knocked Loose trying to emulate classic Unearth. There's some darker, more sinister riffery interwoven in between some bouncy, cathartic grooves and some full-on hardcore brutality. I love those slower, static-drenched grooves near the very end, combined with those aggravating screamed vocals, a lot of pain, torment, anguish channeled here. Then there's FTBS, which probably has one of the best lead guitar riffs on the entire record. It has so much momentum, so much power. It just kind of tears through everything like a literal chainsaw. I really like the syncopated percussion too, it just gives it so much extra oomph. It feels like something that wouldn't be out of place on the Doom soundtrack, honestly. It continues to be a really explosive track as it goes along, throwing in more different kinds of riffs, more slower grooves, barking vocals. Like I said before, the more experimental flavors have been toned down and subdued, but there are still a few twists and turns here and there. Gates of Horn, for instance, almost feels like a full-blown deathcore track with how it specifically combines classic hardcore and death metal. I mean, everything about this, from the blast beats to the breakdowns to the monstrous vocals to the eerier and atmospheric guitar melodies and textures, it just reeks of classic Thy Art Is Murder. The album's closing number as well has quite a few tricks up its sleeve. It has some full-on brutal death metal chugging. It has some more atmospheric backing vocals that give it a lot of height and scale. It has some very scatterbrained percussion and cymbal work that adds a little bit of extra edge as well. Kinda sounds like a nu metal drummer trying his hand at jazz. Really like the monotonous grooves that close out this whole thing as well. It brings everything to like a really sharp and sudden and brutal finish. Stuff like Tunnel Vision, Profane, Silver Lining, all great stuff as well. Just lots of great riffs, lots of great musicianship, great vocal work. The album is pretty well produced, all things considered. I wouldn't mind a little less distortion and static on some of this, especially the vocal work. It can be a little grating on a higher volume. I also do find myself overall wishing that there was a little bit more range and versatility. It is a little weird that they would strip back on some of that for a sophomore album. Why not expand? But whatever, I've really no reason to complain whatsoever. I've thoroughly enjoyed this record. I'm feeling a very enthusiastic 3.5 out of 5, leaning pretty close to a 4 out of 5. Like, I'm almost there. Like, I'm on the verge of a 4 out of 5, but I'm just not quite feeling it. If you're in the mood for some brutal, punishing, modern hardcore and metalcore in the vein of like Knocked Loose and Code Orange and stuff like that, this will more than satisfy and thrill and elate. Hoping this does big things for Jesus Piece, hoping this inspires them to go even further, to get even bolder, to get even bigger, to get even crazier. I feel like if you're really into death metal and extreme metal and you were maybe looking for a decent gateway into metalcore, this would also be a really cool record to check out. Once again, 3.5 out of 5, a very enthusiastic one at that. I do prefer Only Self, all things considered, but this is still a really good record and you should definitely check it out. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be. So what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe right here so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown immediately. And as always, you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.